Owning a farm in a neighborhood that barely tolerates lawn gnomes? Yeah, I knew from day one that I was in for a fight, but I never thought I'd be dealing with the HOA Karen calling 911 on my property, let alone that she'd end up being the one they came for. It all started when I inherited my grandfather's land, a sprawling 15-acre farm just outside the city limits. It had been in my family for generations, a quiet place where we grew produce, kept livestock, and lived peacefully. The farm sat on the edge of a residential neighborhood, and while the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, that didn't stop Karen from trying to rule over it anyway. Karen, who fancied herself the eternal ruler of the HOA, had been a constant source of irritation since I settled in. Her disdain for my farm was palpable as it clashed with the pristine suburban ideals she cherished. My red barn stood out against the beige uniformity of her beloved McMansions, and my animals seemed to be her personal nemeses. She went out of her way to disrupt my peace, insisting I dismantle my fences, labeling them an eyesore. The earthy scent of hay and soil offended her delicate sensibilities, and she even went so far as to ban my farmhands from parking on my own land. Yet the true battle began when she set her sights on my animals. She launched a petition to oust my livestock, rallying her HOA allies to demand the removal of my chickens, goats, and cattle. Her arguments centered on noise, cleanliness, and neighborhood cohesion, conveniently ignoring the fact that my property fell outside HOA jurisdiction and that my family had farmed here long before the neighborhood's inception. I was torn between standing my ground and considering if there was a way to coexist. Ignoring her demands felt right, but it only fueled her resolve. She lodged noise complaints about my distant roosters, summoned city inspectors on false zoning accusations, and even attempted to have my fences removed for obstructing views. When her tactics failed, she resorted to the ultimate move of the entitled. She called the cops. I was working in the barn when I heard the sirens. At first, I thought it was just a passing patrol car, but when two police cruisers pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly who was behind it. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my jeans as two officers climbed out of their cars. Behind them, Karen stood with her arms crossed, looking smug as ever. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, trying to keep my patience. One of the officers, a tall guy with a no-nonsense look, glanced at his notepad. "We received a complaint about illegal livestock and zoning violations." I let out a breath. "I'm guessing Karen?" Karen huffed. "It's Mrs. Davis to you, and yes, I reported it. This farm is a nuisance to the neighborhood, and it's time the law did something about it." The officer said, "Ma'am, his property isn't under the jurisdiction of the HOA, and according to county records, this land is legally zoned for agriculture." Karen smiled, but not in a good way. "Oh, I think you'll want to look a little deeper," she said, pulling out a stack of printed documents. The officer took them, flipping through them with a frown. I had no idea what Karen had cooked up, but I could already tell she thought she had me. I crossed my arms. "So, what exactly am I being accused of?" Karen grinned. "Oh, just a little thing called operating a commercial business without a permit." She had gone through every single farm record she could find, digging up anything she thought she could use against me. She had printed out listings for my farm's produce stand, arguing that since I sold vegetables, eggs, and dairy at the farmer's market, that made my property a business which needed a different kind of zoning permit. "This is a residential area," she said sweetly, "and I do believe commercial operations are strictly prohibited." One of the officers scratched his chin. "Selling at a farmer's market doesn't make this commercial property, ma'am." Karen's face twitched. "Then how about the trucks?" she snapped. "The farm equipment, the deliveries. I have pictures of multiple work trucks entering and leaving the property. That's business activity, isn't it?" I was getting tired of this nonsense. "Karen, those are farm supply deliveries. This is a working farm, you know, the kind that feeds people." But Karen wasn't listening. She was too busy watching the officers, waiting for them to say something that would validate her insanity. And then, just as one of the cops was about to answer, another car pulled up. Not just any car, but a black government vehicle with tinted windows. Karen frowned. "Who's that?" I smiled for the first time that morning. "Oh, Karen, I think you're about to find out." The door opened, and out stepped a serious-looking man in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase. He walked straight past me, nodding toward the officers. "Good morning, gentlemen. I was asked to come down here for a site visit." Karen looked confused. "Who are you?" The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I work with the state's Agricultural Protection Bureau. We received a report that someone was interfering with a legally protected farm." Karen's smug look vanished. The officer holding her documents handed them to the new arrival. "Sir, this is Mrs. Davis. She's the one who made the complaint." The man in the suit nodded. "Thank you. I'll take it from here." And just like that, Karen's entire plan fell apart. She stood there, mouth slightly open, clearly trying to process what was happening. She had expected the cops to shut down my farm, issue fines, or maybe even force me to relocate my animals. Instead, she was now face to face with a state official, one who was here to investigate her. The officer from before, still holding Karen's stack of complaints, handed them over to the man in the suit. "Mr. Leland, she's been making a lot of claims about zoning violations, commercial misuse, and general nuisance complaints." Mr. Leland, still unreadable, took a long look at the papers. Then he turned to me. "Mr. Carter, you own this farm, correct?" I nodded. "That's right. It's been in my family for generations." "And you're operating under a legal agricultural exemption, correct?" I confirmed. "The county and state both recognize my land as farmland, and I have all the proper documentation to prove it." Leland turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, are you aware that this farm is protected under the state's Right to Farm Act?" Karen blinked. "The what?" "The Right to Farm Act," Leland repeated, his tone flat. "It prevents local ordinances and neighborhood regulations from interfering with legally established agricultural operations. That includes noise complaints, aesthetic disputes, and yes, attempts to reclassify farms as commercial businesses just because they conduct basic agricultural trade." Karen's face turned a shade of red that I didn't think was humanly possible. "That's ridiculous. This is a residential community." Leland flipped through the papers before looking up at the police officers. "Can you verify that Mr. Carter's farm was established before this neighborhood was built?" One of the officers, who had already been briefed by the county earlier, nodded. "Yes, sir. The farm has been here for over 100 years. The neighborhood's HOA was formed much later." Leland looked at Karen. "Then, by state law, this farm has more legal standing here than your HOA. You could have heard a pin drop." Karen was fuming, but that's not fair. These people didn't move here to live next to a barnyard. They want peace, cleanliness, order. Leland raised an eyebrow. "And Mr. Carter wants to keep his legally protected farm, which existed before any of you moved in. If your HOA wanted to avoid agricultural properties, it should have done better research before expanding into farm-adjacent land." Karen actually stomped her foot like a child. "This is insane. I've had to put up with the stench, the noise, and the eyesore of this farm for years. It's time it goes." Leland sighed, pulling out his tablet. "Miss Davis, I'll remind you that filing false complaints against a legally protected agricultural property is considered harassment under the state's agricultural laws. Additionally, any attempt to restrict, interfere with, or disrupt its operation without just cause could result in civil penalties." Karen paled. "Civil penalties?" "Yes," Leland said. "That means fines, lawsuits, and possible liability for any financial damages Mr. Carter incurs due to these repeated false complaints." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Karen, of course, refused to go down without one last ridiculous attempt to shift blame. "This is corruption," she screamed, pointing at me. "You paid these people off, bribed them to protect your filthy farm." Leland, to his credit, didn't even react to her outburst. He simply sighed and turned to the police officers. "Officers, I believe we're done here. I'll be filing a formal complaint against Miss Davis for repeated malicious legal actions against this farm. The Department of Agriculture will be in touch." One of the officers turned to Karen. "Ma'am, at this point, we're going to strongly advise that you stop interfering with this property. Continuing down this path could lead to legal consequences." Karen's face twisted into something between rage and disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Very serious," Leland said. "And if you continue harassing Mr. Carter, we will have no choice but to escalate the matter." Karen lost it. She launched into a tirade of complaints, accusations, and increasingly wild conspiracy theories about how I was somehow tricking the government into backing me up. But no one was listening anymore. Leland, the officers, and even the neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle had all checked out. Finally, one of the officers sighed. "All right, ma'am, I think we're done here. We're going to have to ask you to leave the property." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the other officer cut in. "If you refuse, we'll have to file a formal trespassing complaint." Karen's jaw snapped shut so hard I thought her teeth might crack as she turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house. I let out a slow breath, watching her retreat. Leland turned to me, shaking his head. "People like that never learn, huh?" "Never," I agreed. Leland gave me a firm nod. "I'll be in touch soon. If she causes you any more problems, let me know. We'll handle it." "Thanks," I said. With that, Leland and the officers left, leaving me standing in the middle of my farm, finally able to breathe easy. But as I watched Karen stomp up her driveway, one thought crossed my mind. This might be over for now, but knowing her, she wasn't done yet. Karen's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Gone was the smugness, the air of superiority. Now she was standing frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Wait, hold on," she stammered, turning back toward the officers. "I called you here. You're supposed to be handling him, not me." Leland, the Agricultural Protection Bureau officer, remained completely unfazed. "Miss Davis, your complaints have been investigated and they hold no legal merit. However, your continued interference with this farm is a separate matter, one that falls under my department's jurisdiction." Karen's face turned an impressive shade of red. "That's ridiculous. You work for the state. The state can't just barge into a private neighborhood and start making threats." Leland sighed, pulling out a small, official-looking booklet from his briefcase. "Miss Davis, this is the Right to Farm Act, a legally binding document that protects established farms like Mr. Carter's from unlawful interference." He flipped to a page and pointed at a highlighted section. It explicitly states that any individual or entity that knowingly obstructs, disrupts, or harasses a legally recognized farm can face civil penalties and, if damages are proven, criminal charges. Karen froze. Criminal charges? The officers nodded grimly. "Ma'am, you filed multiple false reports against this property, attempted to manipulate zoning laws under fraudulent pretenses, and knowingly interfered with a protected agricultural operation. That's more than enough grounds for an official investigation." Karen stumbled back, clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of legal shield. "You can't be serious. I was only trying to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. I was doing my duty." Leland didn't even flinch. "Your duty has resulted in repeated legal complaints, misuse of emergency resources, and attempted property interference." Karen whipped around toward the gathered neighbors, desperate for backup. "You all saw this. He's ruining our community, making this place unlivable. We need to stand together." But instead of nodding along in agreement, the crowd stayed silent. A few homeowners glanced at each other uncomfortably. One of them, a man named Mr. Reynolds, finally spoke up. "Karen, you've gone too far." Karen's face twitched. "Excuse me? This farm has been here long before we moved in," he continued. "And let's be honest, you've been harassing him for years. You call the cops over everything, you demand ridiculous changes, and now you're filing fraudulent complaints." Another neighbor, Mrs. Carter, crossed her arms. "We moved here for peace, Karen, but ever since you became HOA president, all you do is make problems where there aren't any." Karen looked genuinely betrayed. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect property values. I was protecting—" Mr. Reynolds scoffed. "Karen, my home's value has gone down since you started running this HOA like a dictatorship. You fine people for leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes late. You threatened to tow cars that were legally parked, and now this." Karen whirled back toward the officers. "You can't punish me for trying to keep order." But Leland wasn't done. "Miss Davis, we're filing an official report on your unlawful actions against this farm. The Department of Agriculture will be contacting you regarding fines and potential legal proceedings. Additionally, based on what we've heard today, there may be cause for further investigation into the HOA's operations." Karen's eyes went wide. "What do you mean?" One of the officers, clearly fed up, pulled out a notepad. We've received multiple complaints about your conduct as HOA president. This might go beyond farm interference. We'll be looking into how you've been running things. Karen's entire body went rigid. Then, to make matters worse, a third police cruiser pulled into the driveway. A younger officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, and walked over to the group. Sorry to interrupt, but we just got confirmation from the county clerk's office. They flagged some irregularities in the HOA's financial filings. We need to bring in Mrs. Davis for questioning. Karen choked. What? What? The senior officer sighed. Ms. Davis, we're going to need you to come with us. Karen staggered back. No, this is a mistake. You should be arresting him. She pointed wildly at me, but nobody was listening. The officers stepped forward and Karen screeched in fury. You can't do this. I am the HOA president. President, not anymore, Mr. Reynolds spat out with a hint of satisfaction. Karen struggled fiercely, her attempts to break free futile against the officers who forcefully restrained her. Her furious shouts echoed through the neighborhood, bouncing off indifferent ears. The entire community stood frozen in shock as she was dragged to the waiting police cruiser. Just before they slammed the door shut, she locked eyes with me, her face a mask of seething fury. You ruined everything, I smirked, the weight of triumph in my voice. No, Karen, you did that all by yourself. As the police cruisers roared away, a slow, rhythmic applause began to ripple through the crowd, growing louder and more confident. Mr. Reynolds turned to me with a knowing nod. Guess she finally pushed too far. Guess so, I replied, shaking my head with disbelief. And here I thought I was the one in trouble. Leland let out a deep, resonant chuckle. Sometimes people dig their own graves. You just have to stand back and let them keep on digging. With Karen gone, the HOA under harsh scrutiny, and my farm basking in newfound security, I felt a rush of liberation like never before. I was finally free.